Now, we had the idea some time ago of doing the 2008 presidential lecture series on the 2007 presidential lecture series on the 2008 campaign. But then President Ford, our 38th president, passed away over the holidays. And we felt it was important for us to recognize his contributions and to organize a tribute. And so we're delighted that we could do that tonight. Who better to talk about President Ford and his achievements than the nationally known presidential historian who ran President Ford's library and delivered his eulogy in Grand Rapids. Richard Norton Smith was the first permanent director of the Dole Institute. At the salute dinner 2 weeks ago, where I was talking about we raised $2 million, I said that there were 3 individuals that had made my job as director here extraordinarily easy. First was the man, Bob Dole. He has a tremendous legacy of leadership, and as I said then, it's an honor to be working for him again. Secondly was the catalyst, the one who approached Bob Dole about locating his institute here, Bob Hemingway, the chancellor of the university. And he's been extraordinarily supportive and has been great to work with. But the third man who made my job very easy is the visionary who conceived the idea for this astounding place that we're enjoying tonight and that I get to be in every day when I come to work. We are very pleased to have tonight with us to talk about President Ford and his legacy, Richard Norton Smith. Rick? Thank you. We're delighted to have you here tonight.
It's nice to be home.
It's good to have you back.
It really is. Thanks. It's so nice to see so many of you. Lots of familiar faces. Thank you so much for coming out on a cold night.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is unscripted, but I can't come back here or sit here as part of this program without saying what a fantastic job Bill and his colleagues are doing. I mean, it's one thing to build a building. It's another to make it come alive, and that's what they are doing. And it's wonderful to see the contribution that you're making, not only to this university and this community, but to this state.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Richard and I have some interesting parallels. I first met Ronald Reagan, who I went on to work with when I was in college. You first met President Ford when you were in college at Harvard, I believe.
Actually, I can beat you because I was an adolescent of annoying precocity, which was actually a preview of coming attractions, I guess. I was just plain annoying adult. But anyway, at the age of 11, I decided I was going to start collecting autographs of political figures. And in the summer of 1965, I wrote off to 30 or 40 people, including Ronald Reagan, including Nelson Rockefeller, and including Gerald Ford. And I got back a lovely letter from the House Minority Leader, elected in the debris of the Goldwater disaster. But then we actually crossed paths for the first time about 9 years later. I was at Harvard, and as I said in the eulogy, we were surprised that Richard Nixon's vice president would come to Harvard. He was surprised that there were enough Republicans at Harvard to form a club. And it was an extraordinary experience, and I introduced him. And being annoying, off stage, couldn't resist showing him a derogatory caricature. I mean, go back 35 years and imagine yourself on the Harvard campus. Students for a Democratic Society had plastered the place with this caricature of Gerald Ford as a puppet impaled on the arm of a sinister-looking Richard Nixon. And I showed it to him, you know. What a smart ass. And that, which is what most politicians would have said. They would have said it, but they would have thought it. Most politicians would have blanched. He chuckled. He thought it was genuinely amusing, and then he asked if he could have a copy to display in his office. And that's the first time I knew this was not your typical, politician, not your typical fill in the blank.
Right. Well, we're going to focus tonight mostly on his presidency, but there are a couple of other aspects that I'd like to get into with you, Rick, if I can. Some may not know this, but President Ford was almost killed during World War II aboard the USS Monterey during a typhoon. Can you recount that story?
Yeah. Actually, a little background on the evening of August 8th, 1974, after Nixon announced his resignation. Of course, the Ford's lives were turned upside down, and that night they went to bed and they held hands and they said a prayer from Proverbs that he had learned as a boy in Grand Rapids and had used often. He used it the day as a teenager that he discovered that his birth father was not the man he regarded, as his father. And another occasion was in December of 1944 in the Philippine Sea. There was a typhoon with plus 100 knot winds, and he rushed up in the middle of the typhoon. Lo and behold, fire broke out on board the Monterey, which was a light aircraft carrier. Ord had originally enlisted in the Navy and had been sent to do physical education in North Carolina. That wasn't his idea of fighting for his country. So he did whatever he could to get onto a ship. And he got onto the Monterey. And in the middle of this typhoon, a great wave crashed over the thing and carried him all the way to the edge of the ship. And there was a 2-inch railing around the ship. And that's literally what saved his life. And perhaps Proverbs. And 30 years later, it was a different kind of storm in which he found himself.
Very definitely. It was very, very clear from the time that he kind of grew up on the national scene that he and Mrs. Ford were extraordinarily close, that they were real partners. Talk to us about that a little bit. She just had such an incredible impact on his life.
Yeah, and I think in some ways it's such a contemporary story. People thought of Ford at first blush in '74 as this kind of white bread congressman from West Michigan, who couldn't possibly be plugged into the zeitgeist, And the fact of the matter is, by then, Mrs. Ford was struggling with what we later learned were some addictions to painkillers. She was seeing a psychotherapist. All sorts of things that, in those days would have destroyed a political career. But when people talk about the Fords being grounded, it's the whole family that's grounded. One of my favorite stories, on August 8th, we all remember, Richard Nixon was made for television. Whatever you think of Nixon, from the checker speech to the helicopter, to whatever. Nixon was this mesmerizing TV presence. And Ford's best moments were off camera. When you think of August 8th, we all think of Nixon standing in the helicopter, getting ready to leave. And I thought to myself, well, I wonder what Ford said on the way back from the helicopter. What would you say? And I asked him years later. He leaned over into Mrs. Ford's ear and said, "We can do it," which tells you volumes. This man whose first job was to reassure the country understood that first he had to reassure his wife. She'd said, "All right, Jerry, if we have to, I will go live in the White House. But I'm too old to change. They're going to have to take me the way I am." Susan, who was not too old to change, was in tears because she said, "Does this mean I have to give up my blue jeans living in the White House?" The great story that tells you something about the whole Ford family, that night, because remember, the Nixons moved out. Obviously, they went off to San Clemente. But it was so hasty that the Fords didn't really move into the White House for 2 weeks. They went back to their house in Alexandria for 2 weeks. And every day the president would go to the White House, go to work, and then come back to the suburbs at night. Anyway, on the night of August 9th, Mrs. Ford is in the kitchen slaving over a hot pan of lasagna. And she said, "Jerry, there's something wrong with this picture. You're president of the United States, and I'm still cooking." And that tells you something about that relationship. And she kept him grounded. The famous 60 Minutes interview, Morley Safer said, she said, "You can ask me anything you want. My husband won't mind." Famous last words. And Morley Safer said, "Okay, do you ever tell him, you know, Jerry, you weren't very good today?" She said, "Sure." She said, "You know, I'm his worst or best critic." And that's exactly the kind of relationship they had. The greatest trial for Gerald Ford, if you ask President Ford what was the worst part of those first few weeks, it wasn't the pardon, horrible as that was. Going to Pittsburgh the next day and having a crowd yell, "Jail to Ford." The worst thing came 10 days later when Mrs. Ford went into the hospital for a surgery. No one really knew how drastic it was going to be. No one really knew much at all about it. He went home that night, Friday night, and he said it was the loneliest night of his life. And the next day they operated. Of course, she had the mastectomy. It was stage 2 cancer. It was a traumatizing experience for the whole family. They all gathered in the hospital and said, "How are we going to handle this? How are we going to communicate this?" And there was no question about it, being the people they are, that they were going to be completely candid. It's hard to believe now. There are some people here who will remember 30 years ago, you didn't talk about cancer. You didn't talk about breast cancer. And that silence was in many ways a death sentence. And the irony is that Mrs. Ford's ordeal, I think, did more than anything else to transform society's attitudes. And she did say that the one good thing about it was before she left the hospital, she turned on the radio and she heard reports about women all over America who had been inspired by her example and who went to get checkups and saved their lives. The power of the First Lady.
And then you were sharing earlier the fact that she went through a lot during all of the different funeral proceedings. And just recount what you told us a little bit earlier.
Well, I mean,
why she was able to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you saw any of the funeral coverage, she'll be 89 in April. She's tiny, she's frail, and I at times wondered how she physically managed to get through the week. It's a very grueling experience, I can tell you. As someone who was sort of in the middle of it, I mean, I was exhausted, and God knows. The camera wasn't on me. It was on them all the time. And if you remember the last day at the time of the interment, there's a very long walk all the way, the length of the Ford Museum to the burial spot. And she was in a wheelchair and insisted on getting out of the wheelchair and making that walk. And I talked to someone in the office on Saturday after they got home and said, "I don't know how she ever did it." And she had actually already said the same thing to Mrs. Ford. She said, "That's what my husband would have wanted." Which tells you a lot about the kind of person she is and, the kind of relationship that they had. They were married for 58 years. It was, I think, the greatest source of pleasure and the greatest source of pride in his life.
He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1948, and in a relatively short, I think 16 years later, he was elected the Republican leader in the U.S. House. And
you have to remember why he was elected in 48. It's very interesting because, he came back, lots of veterans came back from the war. This whole class of 46 and 48, people like Dick Nixon, Jack Kennedy, all these future leaders, Lyndon Johnson. The interesting thing about Ford was he had been an isolationist before the war. At Yale, he'd actually belonged to America First. And so he goes off, he fights in the Pacific. He has a conversion like his hometown hero, Arthur Vandenberg, Senator Vandenberg. Anyway, he comes back and he runs for office for the best of reasons, because of an idea. And the idea is the United States can no longer take shelter behind two oceans. We are, like it or not, a world power, and if we actually care about preserving what we have just fought and bled and died for, then we will step up to our responsibilities as a world power. He took on an entrenched Republican congressman, a guy who thought the world ended at somewhere around Terre Haute, and for him, no doubt it did, who opposed the Marshall Plan, who opposed foreign aid, who opposed, and no one gave him a prayer, and he out-hustled him, out-campaigned him. He proposed to Mrs. Ford in the spring of 1948, but it was a very unusual proposal. He said, Betty, I want to marry you, but I can't tell you when, and I can't tell you why I can't tell you. And the fact is that he wanted to take this congressman by surprise in the Republican primary. And he did. They were married 3 weeks before Election Day. He showed up wearing one black shoe and one brown shoe. And their honeymoon consisted of going to a University of Michigan football game in Ann Arbor, and then that night driving to Owasso, Michigan, sitting in a cold, rainy outdoor stadium listening to cold Thomas E. Dewey orate, the favorite son of Owasso. And then they came back to Grand Rapids, and the president announced that he had some campaigning to do. Could she make him some sandwiches? And he said 50 years later that she had never let him forget. And they'd had many second honeymoons as a result.
Well, he had a very distinguished career in Congress and as the Republican leader in the House. But he got kind of the point where he had decided he probably wasn't going to run for re-election. I believe in his autobiography he mentions that he wanted to get everything down to a more simple, gentlemanly life. He wanted to, I believe he said he wanted to play golf 4 days a week and practice law 3. All of a sudden, on October 10th, 1973, Spiro Agnew resigned from the vice presidency. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us why Nixon picked Ford.
Well, it's true. He had promised Mrs. Ford what he wanted. Remember, he never wanted to be president. He never wanted to be vice president. What he wanted desperately was to be Speaker of the House. And remember, Nixon in '66 there'd been this big comeback after the Goldwater disaster, and then Nixon won in '68. They had 192 seats, so they only needed to pick up another 25 seats or so, and he could see his goal finally coming into view. And, well, needless to say, the Nixon landslide in '72 didn't get him any closer. So he decided at that point, he sort of gave in to Mrs. Ford. He'd been in Washington 24 years. He said, I'm never going to be Speaker. I'm young enough, I can go back and make some money to provide for my family, because he had nothing. And he had 4 kids. So anyway, so that was the plan. He was going to run again in '72, announce his retirement, and in January of 1974, in January of 1977, he was going to leave Washington, and they were going to go back to Grand Rapids. And then along came Watergate, and the Spiro Agnew, Vice President Agnew, was indicted, or was going to be indicted, basically for, not to put too fine a point on it, taking cash in bags under the table. That's how they do things in Maryland. That was the defense, anyway. Didn't wash with Elliot Richardson, who was Attorney General at the time. So Agnew is out. Now, here's how different things were 30 years ago. On that day, Ford didn't know Agnew was leaving. Nixon, who was a very kind of crafty guy, invited Ford up to see him, not in the Oval Office, which he didn't like. Nixon liked to hide out in the hideaway across the street in the old Executive Office building. And that's where Nixon literally could relax. And he'd put his feet up and he'd smoke a pipe, and came as close to being relaxed as Richard Nixon probably ever did. And he invited Ford up, never told him why, never told him Agnew was leaving, just, shot the breeze for an hour. Ford goes back to the Hill and learns for the first time that Spiro Agnew has resigned, and all of a sudden understands why the president had invited him up there for this sort of round the subject talk. A couple days later, Gerald Ford was not Richard Nixon's first choice for vice president. Had it been left to his own devices, he would have chosen John Connally. He was mesmerized by John Connally, big, swaggering, self-assured Texan who had been Secretary of the Treasury and Nixon's kind of guy. But Connally could not have been confirmed. The question in those days, Nixon was so weakened politically that basically the issue was, who can you confirm? He thought about Nelson Rockefeller, but that would have alienated the right wing of the Republican Party. He thought about Ronald Reagan. That would have in those days there was a left wing in the Republican Party, and he would have alienated the Rockefeller Republicans. the Democrats on the Hill came to the White House and said, Jerry Ford can be confirmed. And so basically Nixon was backed into this selection that he made somewhat half-heartedly. But to show you what a different media climate we're in, on the night of October 12th, I think it is, 6 o'clock, the phone rings in the Ford's home in Alexandria. Susan Ford picks up the phone and says, Dad, it's the White House calling. The president, or then, Gerald Ford gets on the phone. It's Richard Nixon. He wants to get Betty on the phone, the other phone. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, they make the offer, and guess what? 2 hours later, they have to be in the East Room for a nationally telecast introduction, which means Mrs. Ford has to find something to wear. The kids all have to get dressed up. They all have to be carted off to the White House and introduced to the country for the first time. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think that just things had sped up in that way.
And then less than a year later, Richard Nixon resigns the presidency and Ford becomes president of the United States. Talk about his first days as president, about his decision to select Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president, and also let's go ahead and talk about the pardon as well.
Well, first of all, the one line that everyone remembers from the speech, "Our long national nightmare is over," Ford wanted to cut from the speech. In many ways, he was pitch perfect during those first few days. He understood the country desperately needed symbolic, inclusive leadership. So one of the first people he called was Charlie Rangel, who was then a very young congressman from Harlem. He said, "Charlie, I'd like to meet with the Congressional Black Caucus." Then he called George Meany of the AFL-CIO. Anyway, he had a whole list of these meetings with people who, needless to say, had not been in the White House in a long time. But the other side of that was he remained, what I say, is Grand Rapids modest. And when he heard the line, "Our long national nightmare is over," he wanted to cut it because he thought it was piling on. And that's critical because it illustrates the challenges he faced turning from a congressman into a president. And I think the first few months were very much a transitional period. And Bob Hartman, the speechwriter, who wrote the inaugural address was 7 minutes long. And Bob Hartman had to get down on his hands and knees and beg and threaten to quit and everything else. And finally Ford said, "Well, maybe you're right." And he gave the speech, and of course that's what we all remember. People all talk about the pardon as a defining moment, and it was. But before the pardon, 2 weeks before the pardon, was another defining moment, which was part of the same unfolding attempt at national reconciliation. He had a plan to basically open the door for thousands of Vietnam-era draft evaders to, as he put it, work their way back. They would set up a clemency board with Father Hesburgh, Theodore Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame, as the chair. And I think he knew in advance Father Hesburgh was going to say yes to 99% of anyone who applied, which in the end is exactly what he did. So this was, by any other name, amnesty. But here's the interesting thing. It was a gutsy thing to say because your base would not necessarily approve. The revealing thing is where he decided to announce it. He deliberately chose to announce it before the National Convention of the VFW. And on the way out to Chicago on the plane, he said to someone, "Well, at least I'm not going to have to worry about being interrupted by applause too often." And if you look at the tape, he was a prophet. I mean, that speech laid an egg. And I think the only reason they didn't boo was Mrs. Ford was sitting in the front, up on stage next to him. But the fact is, that was, in its own way, at least as gutsy an act as the pardon. Now, the pardon, the debate goes on, and the debate will go on for years. I will never forget one of the great experiences of my life was to spend an evening with the president in a hotel room in Grand Rapids about maybe 8 or 9 years ago. For 3 hours, we argued the pardon, back and forth. And I was an agnostic on the pardon. I thought that I didn't have strong feelings one way or the other, but like lots of people, I thought, on balance, it was probably necessary, but there had to have been a better way. There had to have been a more politically adroit way to prepare the country. And by the end of that evening, I had come to the very reluctant conclusion that under the circumstances, given the mood of the country at that time, there was no way you could raise a trial balloon. There was no way you could resort to the usual leaks, because the first sign, the first hint that you were thinking of this, I guarantee it would have been shot down. Congress on both parties would have, denounced it. You have to remember what was going on in the first month of the Ford presidency. Here's a guy who never expected to be president. Literally, I know it sounds hard to believe, but until the last week, until the first week of August, literally never had prepared. There was no transition, nothing. He becomes president. In his first week, Greece and Turkey are about to go to war over Cyprus. There's a crisis with the Soviet Union because the Soviet sub has sunk in the Pacific. And guess what? The United States has a top secret vessel designed by Howard Hughes called the Glomar Explorer, whose purpose is to reach out these great claws and grab a Soviet submarine. And, needless to say, the public didn't know about that. King Hussein of Jordan is scheduled to come for an important state visit. Talk about the Middle East. The inflation rate for the month of July 1974 was released. It was 3.7%. 1 month, not a year. Anyway, all of this is happening to this brand new president. Oh, and one other thing. On the 4th day he was president, when they were finally moving his things into the Oval Office, they found 2 more bugs in the walls of the Oval Office behind pictures. And Ford, for the first time, lost his temper. Because the first order he had given when he moved into the Oval Office is, I want every bug out of this place. So anyway, you had all of this going on, and you had the lawyers, you had Al Haig on behalf of the Nixon loyalists who were saying, when are you going to send the papers out to San Clemente? Why haven't you sent all those tapes out to San Clemente? Because remember, for 200 years, presidents took their papers with them. They were their personal property. So you had the Nixon tapes, you had the Nixon papers. Behind the scenes, the special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, was telling the White House, very unofficially, that it could be 2 years before Nixon ever saw the inside of a courtroom if they decided that he could get a fair trial at all. So here is Ford sitting, looking out over this ocean of troubles. The country is obsessed with Nixon. The triggering event, in my opinion, the triggering event in the pardon is a press conference on August 28th. He goes in naively assuming that the press is going to want to talk about Cyprus and inflation and anything but Nixon, and all they wanted to talk about was Nixon. Now, one of the things that people didn't know about Gerald Ford is he had a very sharp temper. He had spent a lifetime controlling it, and controlling it very well. But he had a temper, and he lost his temper that night. He was angry with himself. He wasn't angry at the press, because if you look at the tape, he gives these rambling, contradictory, because he wasn't prepared. And I think that set in motion. And I think he just decided, there was an argument that went on in the Oval Office, and Bob Hartman, the press secretary, was citing poll statistics. And Ford did something very unusual. He slammed his hand against the desk. He said, God damn it, he said, don't tell me about polls. I don't need polls to tell me what's right and wrong. And then he went on to say something very interesting. He said, too many decisions have been made in this office based on politics. And I think at that moment he decided he had no alternative. And there was no good time. There was no good way. It had to be done. So you bite the bullet. On Sunday morning, September 8th, very interesting, before he did it, he didn't take a poll, he said a prayer. He went over to St. John's Episcopal Church early that morning. He sat in St. John's, he took communion, and then he came back at about 8 o'clock in the morning to the White House and taped that announcement. And of course the country went into another firestorm. Overnight, he had the biggest drop in poll ratings ever recorded, 22 points, from a 71% approval rating to a 49% approval rating. And in some ways, he never recovered.
And 30 years later, it's considered an act of political courage.
30 years later, one of the wonderful things, the president lived long enough to know that not only scholars, but that I think the majority, and I think the great majority of his countrymen had come to believe not only that he did what was necessary, but he did what was courageous. And I will never forget, again, a day I'll never forget, in May of 2001, when the John F. Kennedy Library presented him with the Profiles in Courage Award, which was pretty courageous on their part. The fact of the matter is there was a very heated debate on the board, and but they went ahead, and I think it was an amazing moment to hear Ted Kennedy say, "I was wrong, President Ford was right." I mean, I think it sort of put the cap on that. And you know, Lyndon Johnson never lived long enough to see, you know, any reassessment of his presidency. Harry Truman lived just long enough to see one. Dwight Eisenhower didn't really. But Gerald Ford was fortunate enough that he did, and I think it was a source of real gratification to him.
He had a lot of foreign policy challenges that occurred during his relatively short time as president. He had SALT II, the Helsinki Accords, the fall of Vietnam, the Maya Gez incident. Do you want to comment on some of that?
Sure.
And how he handled that as...
Well, you know, it's funny. Again, he becomes president on August 8th, and he's already scheduled to meet with Brezhnev. He's going to the Far East. First American president ever to visit Japan. And it tells you something about the changed media climate. This was just before Saturday Night Live went on the air. The president went to Japan, and for some god-awful reason, he had, you know, formal dinnerwear on, and his pants were too short. There was like 3 or 4 inches of shin. And I guarantee you, that's all anyone paid attention to. No one cared what he said to Emperor Hirohito, or vice versa. It was like, you know, it was like George Bush throwing up in the prime minister's lap. And then he went on to Vladivostok, and it was interesting because they found out later on, the night before he met with Brezhnev, Brezhnev had a stroke, and managed to, you know, to conceal it. They rode a train through Siberia and got acquainted. Before he went, the plane, Air Force One, had stopped in Alaska for refueling, and a friend there had presented him with a wolfskin coat. And all through the Vladivostok conference, Brezhnev, who was a real kleptomaniac, he got a car out of Richard Nixon by, you know, admiring. He couldn't take his eyes off this coat. So at the airport when they left, the president, you know, took off the coat, handed it to Brezhnev, who was thrilled, and then he said, you know, what am I going to tell my friend, you know, who gave me the coat? But the interesting thing is that's all he gave away at Vladivostok. The right forgets it, but, you know, there was a weapons system in development then called the cruise missile. And no one knew whether the cruise missile would work or not. And Ford was so convinced of its... Because remember, Ford had spent 25 years on the Armed Defense Appropriations Committee. So Ford knew the military inside out. And Ford was a great believer in the cruise missile. And the Soviets pressed very, very hard. And he refused to yield. And so they made progress on SALT, but they never really were able to close the deal. The other great frustration he had, of course, was with the Soviet Jews. I mean, he negotiated a deal with the Russians to increase. The Russians were under a lot of pressure, deservedly, for their treatment of Jews and refuseniks and in fact prisoners of conscience. And they had, under pressure, sub rosa, agreed to let as many as 35,000 a year emigrate, primarily to Israel. Ford got that number bumped up to 60,000 a year. But there was a condition, a big condition, and that is no one could announce it, so he couldn't get any credit, and no one could put it on paper to formalize it. It had to be a handshake deal. The Soviets would abide by it. But of course, Scoop Jackson, who was running for president, created something called the Jackson-Vanik Agreement, which was great politics, which criticized the Soviets for their treatment of those who were religiously persecuted, and put all sorts of mandates upon U.S.-Soviet trade. And in the end, they lost the trade, and they lost the 60,000 a year. And I mean, Ford was just, that kind of stuff drove him up the wall. Congress had changed. I mean, he'd spent 25 years in a body where basically, at 6 o'clock, you adjourned partisanship, you had a drink, you were on a first-name basis, you shook hands, and you honored your word. That's how the institution worked. When he came up with the first energy policy in American history, a 167-page detailed blueprint for energy conservation and alternative energy sources, along with the decontrol of energy prices. Something to offend everyone. But anyway, he asked Mike Mansfield and Carl Albert, who are good friends, would you please, we have a crisis. Remember the energy crisis? We have a crisis. Would you respond in kind, create a joint congressional committee? I'm not asking you to pass this, I'm just saying create a joint congressional committee, exert some imagination so that we can get something fast, whatever it is. They said, oh, I'm sorry, that would upset the procedure. Anyway, they went back and forth over decontrol. How, 90 days, whatever. They finally came up with a deal. A week later, they came back and said, sorry, we can't deliver on our promise. The troops won't go along with it. So I think one of the things that Ford had to deal with as president, ironically, for someone who'd spent his whole life in Congress, he becomes president and he finds himself defending the prerogatives of the executive branch against his colleagues. And of course, there was the whole influx of Watergate babies in the 74 off-year elections. That made for a very contentious relationship. Gerald Ford vetoed 66 spending bills. Now, how many spending bills has George W. Bush vetoed? I don't think he's vetoed one. And, and Ford took a lot of heat. People said he has no vision. He had a vision. He didn't want the government to, practice pickpocket economics. He wanted to restrain the growth of government, and he was willing to use the veto power if that's what it took. He's really the last president who made a significant effort to try to restrain the fundamental growth of government.
Talk about the 76 presidential campaign for a minute. Give me a couple or three more questions, then we'll get to questions and answers. The last national convention that really mattered was about an hour away in Kansas City when the president barely beat back a challenge from Governor Reagan. Bob Dole came out of that convention as a vice presidential candidate. Speak to that issue.
Yeah, well, of course, remember, he had, several months earlier, under pressure from the right, he had dumped Nelson Rockefeller, and no one knew who was going to be his pick. And he had come from behind and won the New Hampshire primary. Then he won Florida, and Reagan was on the ropes until, and this is revealing, critical moment, Reagan discovered foreign policy. I mean, he was against the Panama Canal Treaty. He was against any real change in American policy in Africa, in black Africa, and arms control. Basically, he was a strong critic of détente, and a very effective one, very powerful one. And he rode those issues to victories in North Carolina and a number of southern states, and in fact, at one point led in delegates. Defining moment, right before the Texas primary on May 1st, there's a meeting in the Oval Office. Henry Kissinger is supposed to go to Africa. And the reason he's going to Africa is to announce a fundamental change in American policy toward Africa. And that changes. The United States will no longer support white minority governments, specifically in Rhodesia, on its way to becoming Zimbabwe, and implicitly throughout the whole rest of the continent. The fact is, it is time for black majority rule. The writing is on the wall for South Africa and apartheid, and there was a heated debate in the Oval Office because this was not a policy on the face of it that would win a whole lot of delegates in Texas. And couldn't Henry delay his trip? And the president said, no, it's the right thing to do, and basically went ahead. Well, he lost the Texas primary 100 delegates to 0. And as you say, came into Kansas City about 100 delegates ahead of Reagan. Reagan then tried something tactically daring, some would say desperate. He named his own vice presidential nominee. And it turned out to be too clever by half because, classically, you try to compensate for your strengths and your weaknesses. So he announced Dick Schweiker, who was a liberal Republican from Pennsylvania, would be his running mate. And the idea was this would break open the Pennsylvania delegation, and all you needed was to win a few delegates, and he'd go over the top. It was risky. It backfired. But on the other hand, it was a bold, and in many ways it was a preview that Reagan was an unconventional conservative. Reagan was a bold, outside the box kind of conservative, and then they tried to force the critical vote at the convention came on the vice presidency. They introduced a resolution to force President Ford to announce who would be his running mate. And everyone knew this was a vote about who was going to be nominated. And by this time, now Ford had made concessions, foreign policy on the platform. Henry Kissinger had smoke coming out of his ears because the Republican platform in '76 not only did not endorse détente, but really backed away from the whole Kissinger policy. Kissinger wanted to fight it out on the floor. Ford and cooler heads said, look, we've got bigger fish to fry. No one cares about the platform, but we care about the nomination. Anyway, so the right got the platform. They lost that critical procedural vote on the vice presidency. So then the question becomes, okay, who is he going to choose to be vice president? Polls had been taken. There were several names in contention. Mrs. Ford was campaigning for a woman. She'd already gotten Carla Hills into the cabinet. She almost got a woman on the Supreme Court when Justice Douglas retired and the president chose John Paul Stevens. And the woman on the short list was Anne Armstrong of Texas, who was then ambassador to Great Britain. And she was seriously considered, as was Howard Baker, as was Bill Ruckelshaus, a name from the past, who would have been sort of inoculation against the Nixon pardon, the Watergate, having resigned as a point of honor rather than fire the special prosecutor. I think Ruckelshaus was in it right up until the end. And Dole's name actually didn't come into it until later on. To this day, there's a debate over what the Reagan people really wanted and didn't want. The president was told, Dick Cheney has told me, and he's told other people, the president wanted to go over and call on Governor Reagan once the nomination was decided and begin the healing process, because this has been a very bitter contest. He was told, okay, you can come and see the governor on one condition, and that is that you do not bring up the vice presidency. It was as explicit as could be. Now, I don't think he minded, because I don't think at that point he was in a mood to ask Ronald Reagan to be his running mate. But nevertheless, they had a cordial, somewhat, as you might imagine, awkward meeting. But he was mindful of the Reagan people and the need to heal the party. The story that I have just uncovered is they had discussions that went until 4 o'clock in the morning. Nelson Rockefeller was in those discussions. They could not come up with a consensus. Vice President Rockefeller said, Mr. President, to hell with consensus. You've now been nominated in your own right. You don't have to listen to all these people. You just tell them who you want, and they'll nominate him. And Ford said, well, look, let's sleep on it. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, they adjourned. They were going to meet again at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, something like that. In the meantime, Rockefeller and one of his political aides, a man named George Hinman, who you know, national committeeman from New York, went to the breakfast meetings with the other delegates. Hinman calls Rockefeller and says, hey, the Southerners, which were the core of the Reagan people, the Southerners say they're prepared to drop Reagan as a vice presidential candidate and go with Dole. Rockefeller said, you know, how widely are you hearing this? And Hinman said, widely. He said, well, I think we ought to tell the president. So they head back to the hotel, and before the 10 o'clock meeting, Rockefeller sees the president and relates this information. The meeting begins. President Ford says, Nelson has something to tell us. He relates this story, and at that point, the meeting was all about Bob Dole, and within the hour, it was decided that Bob Dole would be the running mate. Bob Dole was selected because Gerald Ford believed that it would help unify the party, that it would be well received by Governor Reagan personally, by Reagan Republicans generally. He knew Dole intimately. He owed Dole because in 1965, when he ran for House Minority Leader, he won that race by 3 votes. And those 3 votes were supplied by the Kansas delegation, led by a 41-year-old congressman named Bob Dole. So they had a long-standing relationship. He knew Dole. He liked him. And the final thing is, critically, the base. They had no base. They were 30 points down in the polls, and there were problems in the Farm Belt. And if a Republican, as you know, running for national office, is worried about carrying Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, then he probably should take his name off the ballot. So the very first rule of politics is secure your base. And by choosing Bob Dole, Ford secured his base, not only geographically, but I think demographically, for example, with veterans.
As you just noted, Rick, the Ford-Dole ticket came out of Kansas City, 30 points behind, totally untenable position, and then proceeded to make what is arguably one of the most magnificent comebacks in the history of presidential politics. Speak to that.
Well, it's true, and of course, people now you think of the debates, and you all know about the Polish gaffe, and the wonderful story about that. Years later, when we were redoing the Ford Museum, President Ford was wonderful because he wanted the whole story told. So when you walk through the Ford Museum and you walk through the 76 campaign, overhead you see a TV screen and it plays endlessly the Polish gaffe, which, to refresh your recollection, he said that Poland, Eastern Europe, is not dominated by the Soviet Union and never will be. Now, it was a gaffe of major proportions. But it's interesting because if you actually go back and read what he said, he mentioned 3 countries, including Poland, 3 countries he had recently visited, 3 countries that were all trying to ease themselves out of the Soviet orbit. One was Yugoslavia, which had long been relatively free, and one was Romania, and the third was Poland. He'd gone to those countries after the Helsinki Accords, which were all about establishing human rights behind the Iron Curtain. So what he should have said was, as a result of the policies of this administration and the Helsinki Accords, I've seen with my own eyes that the people of Eastern Europe, though they may be politically dominated by the Soviet Union, I can tell you they don't feel spiritually dominated by the Soviet Union. If he'd said that, he would have hit a home run. He won the first debate going away. At the end of the first debate, by the end of the first debate, the first poll showed that the gap had narrowed to 10 points. And going into the second debate, which was foreign policy, everyone thought, well, this will be his strength as an incumbent. And he stepped in it on Poland. And then he made it worse because he is a very stubborn man. And he refused to admit that he'd screwed up. And a day went by, and 2 days went by, and 3 days went by. And finally, he was prevailed upon to come out and tell the press that he had misspoke, and to say how he should have put it. If he had, who knows? But those last 10 days, people for long memory, that was the first time I voted for a presidential candidate. And I can remember, day by day by day, you could sense this thing was really moving. And what happened in the last weekend, a poll appeared, a Harris poll appeared, that Gerald Ford had actually taken a 1-point lead over Jimmy Carter. And people were talking about a bigger comeback than Harry Truman. And what happened the last weekend was, in November, the first week of November, the last week of the campaign, they released the unemployment numbers for October. And they went from 7.3% to 7.9%. And at the very least, it suggested that the economic recovery that Ford was taking credit for had paused, had come to a halt, perhaps had reversed, and it fed the doubts. And I said, as I said earlier tonight, I think what happened was people sort of realized that weekend, you know what, this is a dead heat. This could go either way. And they looked in the mirror and said, am I really confident enough that I want 4 more years? And people say the Nixon pardon cost him the election. There was a poll after the internal polling showed 7% of Republicans voted for Carter specifically because of the Nixon pardon. And obviously that would more than account for the victory. But personally, I will always believe that it was the economy at the very end of the campaign that made people step back and change their minds again.
And if just a handful of votes in a couple states had switched over, he would have been reelected. So it's an incredible story.
Ohio went to Carter, by 10,000 votes. And Hawaii, which is a very reliably Democratic state, was carried by only a few thousand votes. But he was not the sort of person, he didn't harbor, he didn't dwell on that. The morning after he lost, he lost his voice. He lost the White House and he lost his voice. And the morning after, he was in the Oval Office consoling staffers and asking them what he could do to get them jobs. He was thinking about them, and it was just, it's one reason why it's interesting. Most people don't know. Every June, the Ford White House alumni gather in Washington. I think it's the only administration where this happens, and they've been doing it for 30 years. And it's because of the loyalty. Loyalty goes up and loyalty goes down. And I think people who worked for him in the White House or, whenever, there was a very special kind of attachment that people felt. And he would come back, he and Mrs. Ford, every year until last year. That was the first year when physically they weren't able to get to D.C. But anyway.
Okay. Let's open it up to questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. Wait for someone to bring a mic to you, please. And then please remember, ask a question, don't make a speech. All the speeches are done for the evening. Go ahead.
To borrow a phrase from Bill Lacey, would you speak to Gerald Ford's views of Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld?
At what time in his life? It's interesting. I spoke about loyalty. One of the interesting things about Ford are the careers that he incubated. We all know about Cheney and Rumsfeld. Paul O'Neill, who had a brief unhappy term as Treasury Secretary in this White House. Alan Greenspan, Carla Hills, James Baker started out in the Ford campaign in '76. The list goes on and on and on. Cheney and Rumsfeld, of course, are the most prominent. I can't tell you, A, because I won't tell you, but B, because I don't have that much to withhold about the president's views at the end of his life. I think you're probably referring to the Iraq War, and in particular some of the things that Bob Woodward wrote about even before the funeral. suggesting that the president was not happy with the performance of his former colleagues in this administration. I know that he cherished the relationship that he had with both Cheney and Rumsfeld. The fact that Rumsfeld was a eulogist in Grand Rapids, that Vice President Cheney, I will tell you, the service in the Rotunda and the Capitol, something was made of the fact that the president was at his ranch and didn't come back. The fact is, it was always planned from the beginning that he would not speak there, that it was the vice president who would speak there because of that special relationship that they had. As far as his views on the Iraq War, I think a lot of that is speculative, and I'm uncomfortable, giving you fragments of fragments. Let me say this: there is no doubt that President Ford, I think, became relatively more liberal, certainly on cultural issues, social issues. He and Mrs. Ford were outspokenly pro-choice. They were pro-gay rights. He is the first American president to lend his name officially to an organization dedicated to gay rights. And on a number of other issues, I think he had, I'm not sure he moved so much to the left. I think the party moved to the right. It's a different kind of conservatism. It's more social conservatism, in many ways faith-based, as opposed to the economic conservatism and the anti-communist conservatism of his youth. So to the extent that Cheney and Rumsfeld were in step or lockstep with that Republican Party, that conservatism, I think it's fair to say that there was a crevice that opened ideologically between them, but it never affected their personal relationship.
It's kind of ironic that today Ford and Reagan seem far closer than they would seem to where the party has gone today. So it's really interesting. Do we have other questions?
I really have a question, Bill, and I'm not filibustering, but I wanted to mention something to Richard Norton that I wonder if he remembers. I remember the first time I heard him speak at KU was in the KU Visitors Center because I'd read your book about George Washington, and I wanted to hear you discuss it. And I would say there was a third of the crowd that's here tonight when I went to hear you, which I enjoyed. But my question is...
Actually, I think it was about a tenth, if the truth be told. But
my question is, do you see a parallel between President Truman and President Ford in the manner in which they achieved office and had extremely difficult decision to make?
Not only that, I think the parallel goes beyond that. I think their character, I think the euphemism is they were plain spoken. The fact is they weren't slick, they weren't eloquent, they weren't great communicators. Although certainly Harry Truman had great ideas to communicate. The first thing, it's interesting, a president defines himself in a number of ways. One of the most obvious ways is whose portrait he hangs in the cabinet room. And the day that he became president, Gerald Ford looked at the portraits. He left Lincoln. He left Eisenhower, who I think was his favorite president, truth be told. And he removed Woodrow Wilson, who had been a great hero of Richard Nixon's, and he replaced him with Harry Truman. And another story, when he was a freshman congressman, the lowest of the low, he was on the Public Works Committee. And you can imagine how important that was. Except the White House was falling down. So one Saturday morning, Harry Truman invited the Public Works Committee to come to the White House. And he gave them a personalized tour. And he showed them where Margaret's piano was coming through the ceiling, and where a corner of the East Room was propped up, and literally the house was falling down. And they basically had a choice. They could gut the place, tear the place down, build a new White House, which would have been cheaper. Now Ford, dirty little secret is, Ford was cheap. When the public money was concerned, Ford was as tight as they come. And in any other situation, he would have taken the cheap route. But the majesty of the White House being what it was, he said no. He agreed with President Truman, who said, we'll gut the interior, we'll preserve the walls, and we'll restore the White House. And he came away from that experience with a great admiration for Harry Truman. He admired Truman's foreign policy, bipartisan foreign policy, fighting the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, NATO, all of that. So he was a great admirer of Harry Truman. And I will tell you something that a lot of people don't know. In 1976, near the end of the campaign, the Fords went to Independence, Missouri. Now, President Truman had died by then, but Bess was living on in the Truman house at 219 North Delaware Street. She had the Secret Service across the street because she'd never let them inside the house. But they were there. They were over a garage or something across the street. So anyway, the Fords came to visit Bess, and Bess let them know that she was voting for Gerald Ford for president. And the only thing that tops that was I think George McGovern's shocker. Some of you may have seen one night on Larry King after the president died, when McGovern let it be known that he voted in 1976 for Gerald Ford. And 3 weeks after the election, he was talking to his wife Eleanor, who sadly just passed away about 2 weeks ago. And Mrs. McGovern let slip rather shamefacedly that she had voted for Gerald Ford. And so it tells you something about the McGoverns and the Fords and I suppose Jimmy Carter.
Do we have any more questions in the back, Jessica? Okay, we have some right here.
You mentioned having a discussion with Ford about the decision to pardon, and you said that it went back and forth and back and forth, and you made the comment that wasn't there a better way to do this? What were the options?
There were a number of options. For example, in theory, in a perfect world, you could have waited for Nixon to be indicted. And then, ironically, if Ford had waited 2 months, some of you may remember, Richard Nixon almost died in October of 1974. He went into the hospital for phlebitis, was operated on. The operation was a success. He went back to his room and passed out, internal bleeding. And he very, very nearly died. And it was the weekend before the 74 elections. And Ford was going to be in California. And everyone said, whatever you do, stay away from the hospital. I mean, the last thing you want to do is remind people of Richard Nixon, and the pardon. And he called Julie and said, would it do your dad any good for me to come? And Julie and her mother said, it's the best medicine possible. So he went to the hospital. He reminded everyone of the pardon. Republicans got shellacked on Election Day. The irony is, had he waited until Nixon was on his, quote, deathbed, he might have been able to pardon him on the grounds of compassion and gotten away with it. The main argument, though, was, do you wait until he was indicted? The problem with that was, as I said, Jaworski was telling him, there's no schedule here. I can't tell you whether he's going to be indicted. I can't tell you whether he's ever going to be in a courtroom or not. It's that uncertain, it's that fluid. And every time you tried to nail down a scenario, well, I can do it at this point, or I can do it at this point, or maybe you go through a trial and let him be convicted or found innocent, and then pardon him. But the problem is the thought of an American president in the dock would have so preoccupied and so polarized this country at a time when it was already terribly divided. And I think he's just decided there's only one way to end this. There's only one person who can end this, and that's me.
You spoke earlier, Rick, about what a down-to-earth kind of person the president was, and you told a story about what occurred after a series of meetings with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Can you share that with everybody?
Well, no one remembers today. They may remember the image. The toughest job in a White House is to be the president's no man, is to be the son of a bitch who says, you know what, You're not God. You're just a mortal like anyone else, and you're wrong. Not many people want that job. So usually it falls to the First Lady or the Chief of Staff or both. The interesting thing with Ford is he surrounded himself with people who had carte blanche to say whatever. He was so secure in himself, and including surrounding himself with people whose IQ might be higher, God knows whose egos were greater. I mean, Kissinger and Bill Simon and, I mean, all of these folks. I mean, that was, you know. But anyway, but he always wanted, as long as I had anything to do with the Fords, they loved young people. They liked to be around young people. I noticed, I think that's one reason why we clicked. And they liked bright people, and they liked people who made them laugh. And on 2 out of 3, at least, I passed muster. So anyway, he had an iconoclast in David Kennerly, who was the White House photographer. Now, David Kennerly, some of you may know him. He went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, he's a remarkable artist. But he really got his start in the Ford White House. 2 things. When Vietnam was falling, in the spring of 1975, Ford decided to send the Army Chief of Staff for one last look. But then, and this is what's really revealing, but he in addition to the Army Chief of Staff, he wanted someone who would go over there and come back and tell him the absolute unshirted truth. And he sent Kennerly, his photographer. And they come back from Vietnam, and Kennerly walks into the Oval Office. The president says, well, he said, if they tell you that Saigon is going to last for more than 3 weeks, they are bullshitting you. Don't believe a word of it. And that was a critical moment in the realization that this thing was lost. Kennerly, the iconoclast, however, sometimes pushed the borders. When the president arrived in Salzburg, Austria, for a meeting with Anwar Sadat, which led to the Sinai agreements separating the Egyptian and Israeli armies, which was the precursor to the Camp David Accords negotiated by President Carter, huge step forward on the road to peace. But the only thing people remember is that's when the president slipped down the stairs. It was raining. He was holding an umbrella, and he had his arm around Mrs. Ford. You've all seen the pictures. And he lost his footing, and he slipped down the stairs. Well, at the bottom of the stairs is Kennerly taking pictures. He says, so nice of you to drop in. And Ford, looked at him. You can imagine what the president's advisors thought, and of course they couldn't blame the president, so they blamed the photographers. And again, very revealing of Ford. He said, oh, don't blame them. He said, the poor guys, he said, if they hadn't gotten the picture, they would have lost their jobs. So he couldn't blame them. One reason why I think the press liked Jerry Ford. I mean, when you hear people who, and including people who I'm sure had voted against him, but particularly, not only when he died, but in recent years, people like Bob Schieffer. David Broder said he was the only non-paranoid president in his recollection. Bob Schieffer said he was the most decent public figure he ever knew. Tom Brokaw echoed that and said it, I would add, the most underrated. And I will tell you one story. When we were working on the funeral plans, we wanted to send a message in some ways, and one of the messages we wanted to send was, there was a time, not so very, very long ago, when presidents and reporters could be adversaries and at the same time friends. And so it was decided that one of the eulogists at the cathedral would be a journalist. And originally it was going to be Hugh Sidey, who was a good friend of the president's. And then, of course, Sidey passed away in Paris. And so the president called Tom Brokaw, who got his start as White House correspondent during the Ford presidency. But it was, and the other signal, of course, that we wanted to send, I think there were some people, maybe even there are people in this audience, who were surprised to see Jimmy Carter among the eulogists. But again, the point that the president was making was, you know, they had run a very spirited campaign against each other, no doubt about it. And yet, over time, they became very dear friends and were able to surmount their past differences. And I think that's a lesson that a whole lot of politicians today could learn from.
First, it's great to have you back in Lawrence.
Thank you.
Second, what was Gerald Ford's relationship to those holdovers in the White House from the Nixon administration?
Well, it was difficult. I mean, beginning with Al Haig. I mean, I think he had great respect for Haig's performance. I think he thought that Haig had played an invaluable role in greasing the skids, and that was a thankless job. But he also realized that Haig couldn't stay on as chief of staff. Haig also had, it will come as no surprise, a certain kind of imperial manner to him. Long before he was in charge at the time of the Reagan assassination attempt, he was in charge in the Nixon White House and purportedly in the Ford White House. And in fact, what Ford did on the first or second day he was in office was to ask a young, then young congressman named Donald Rumsfeld, who had gone off and was in Europe, to come back and in effect be White House chief of staff. And what they would do was they would find a job for Haig. He would become NATO commander. Now the problem, Ford later on said that becoming president the way he did was like climbing aboard an airplane that was streaking along at 600 miles an hour with the crew not of his own choosing. And what happened was, over time, there was no mass bloodletting. He replaced most of the Nixon holdovers. And one of the things that I think even critics of the Ford presidency readily acknowledged was, most people think he had the most talented cabinet of any president in modern times. I mean, it was an extraordinary collection of people. You know, Bill Coleman. Ford was the first Republican president to have an African American in his cabinet, and deregulation was a major initiative of transportation. So it was as Secretary of Transportation, Bill Coleman, Bill Simon, certainly one of the most important Treasury secretaries, arguably in American history. Carla Hills, Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft. Very, very capable people. And but it was difficult. I mean, I think that first 6 months was very tough because he had to provide at one and the same time change and continuity, and you had to figure out just how much change and just how much continuity.
We have time for one more question from the audience.
You've touched a little bit on this, but let me ask you to speak specifically about how he made decisions. You've talked about the pardon decision, which the implication is he made that alone, but about the other key decisions he had to make, bringing other ideas in, etc.
It's a great question because he did it in a very distinctive way. And I think this is one area where being a congressman was useful. Ford liked to hear lots of different ideas, lots of different views. He liked to sit back and encourage a debate. He was very comfortable with people challenging, his own viewpoint. I'll give you one tiny example. If you have an adjustable rate mortgage, or if you used an ATM machine sometime this week, that's a result of an argument in the Ford White House. Ford wanted to deregulate the economy. It really began with Ford. And the financial services industry was part of that. And there was a big debate between the traditionalists who said no bank will ever give people money without a piece of paper. And Ford, who is not often thought of as a visionary, Ford actually could imagine a day when exactly that would be the case. And so the ATM machine is one byproduct of that. He was very willing to think outside the box when it came to finding ways to shrink the role of government, to increase the role of the private sector in attacking social ills and the like. Henry Kissinger was not happy. Remember, Kissinger under Nixon wore two hats. He was Secretary of State and he was National Security Advisor. Ford thought that was a bad idea. He was a huge admirer of Henry, although he said, Henry used to resign every weekend. But he was a huge admirer of Kissinger. But he thought there was a reason you had a National Security Advisor. He thought like Eisenhower in that sense, who was very staff-oriented. And the reason was you would have a strong counter voice inside the White House, and anyone who was going to argue with Henry Kissinger was going to have to be pretty strong to stand up to him. And he thought the world of Brent Scowcroft, which I think history has more than justified, and so he took away one of Henry's hats. Kissinger remained Secretary of State, and Brent Scowcroft became National Security Advisor because he wanted to have as many different points of view argued intelligently in front of him before he made a decision. And without naming names, I can think of presidents since who might benefit from encouraging a little bit more of that kind of vigorous give and take, including being willing to listen to people who think you're flat wrong. One more. Let's see if there's one more. I know this gentleman's had his hand up all.
Okay. Do we have a microphone?
Or can you speak?
I think our microphones disappeared.
I can speak it, and you could maybe repeat it, but it's a simple one. The FBI agent that worked for Nixon and did the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, he just recently died and apparently was very bitter because Gerald Ford never pardoned him, even though he was directly following the president's orders. I forget his name, but he died within...
Yeah, I think you're thinking of... No, he wasn't on the FBI. The gentleman asked about an FBI agent who was involved in the Watergate break-in. Actually, it was a CIA agent, Howard Hunt. Howard Hunt. And, that is an argument that was had at the time, and that I suppose people can entertain for years. He didn't pardon the other Watergate conspirators either. I think he believed that justice was done, and that there was something unique about the prospect of having an American president. I mean, he wasn't going to sanction what happened at Watergate. 2 days after the break-in, he said to someone, you have to remember, the first reaction of political professionals was, Nixon can't be involved in this because it's so stupid. Why on earth, if you know anything about politics, why would anyone break into a campaign headquarters, in the idea of getting anything of value, And that was the first reaction. He asked John Mitchell, who was leading the committee, creep, as Bob Dole immortalized it, point blank, was anyone involved with this campaign involved in this break-in? And Mitchell looked him in the eye and lied through his teeth. And Ford, again, can be accused of naivete, but he said later on, I told the truth, I expected people to tell the truth to me. So the question about Howard Hunt and all those folks, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, to be truthful, he didn't think much of Haldeman and Ehrlichman. They treated Congress like a doormat. And the one time that Ehrlichman deigned to come to a meeting on Capitol Hill to meet with his Republican allies, Ehrlichman fell asleep in the course of the meeting, which didn't endear him to the minority leader. So it wasn't as if President Ford wanted to, in effect, issue a blanket approval of what had happened at Watergate. I think he felt that the case of an American president in the dock was unique, and frankly, he could go on and do his job without pardoning Howard Hunt and H.R. Haldeman. He couldn't do his job if he didn't get rid of Richard Nixon, one way or the other. I will tell you very quickly, and we'll close. The president was he didn't gossip, he didn't disparage people. He was visibly uncomfortable when people started dealing in personalities and gossip, which most politicians, love. Like it's the mother's milk of political conversation. And he didn't do that, And I only heard him speak disparagingly. I only heard him in all the years I knew him twice. And now I can tell you, those two people, the worst thing he would say, the worst epithet he could come up with was, he's a bad man, And the two people to whom he applied that, one was Gordon Liddy, and the other was John Dean, which is very nicely balanced if you stop to think about it. Very balanced, like Gerald Ford.
Richard, how will history remember President Ford?
I don't know. I mean, it'll take a while for the dust to settle, but I think enough time has passed. I think whatever his history is, recognizes that he became president in an incredibly awkward, incredibly difficult, probably certainly under the most difficult circumstances since Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. If you look at the films, not of the White House in 1974, but if you look at the films 2 years later, the country at the time of the bicentennial, it was a very different country. That was not just a routine celebration. People were genuinely proud of the institutions of government, and I think more than anything else, that's what he will be associated with. It didn't just happen. It happened because of the kind of character he had, the kind of outlook he had, the kind of leader he was, and I think history and I think this generation of Americans are grateful.
Please join me in thanking Richard for a delightful evening.